Hi, I'm Peter Rowlett.
And I'm Katie Steckles. And Peter, what's today's mathematical object?
Today I brought a book. So my granddad, when he died, left a bunch of stuff in his house, and one of the things was a maths book. So naturally that made its way to me, because I'm a mathematician. Would you like this maths book? And it's one of these fantastic old books, and I thought, oh, this will be good, because I've seen old maths books before, and they're often, full of, I don't know, how to convert things into shillings and pence, and how to deal with different old-fashioned weights and measures and things like that. And I thought, this will be amusing to look through. So I sort of got it out. I haven't really thought about it for a few years. And then just recently I was reading a history of education in the teaching profession in the UK over the last 100 and odd years. And it just put me in mind of this again. I thought, I've got this old book. I'll fish that out and Katie and I can have a chat about it. So it's called Mathematics in Theory and Practice. And what's slightly funny about it is it's hard to tell when it's from. It's also slightly hard to tell who it belonged to, because it comes in a box with my granddad's name on it, but that was also his dad's name. So then it's like, who does it belong to? And when was it from? And there's a postmark that's faded and you can't read the date and all this. So books say when they're from, don't they? Mm. Not always. Yep. Apparently that's quite modern. Well, not very, but it's a little bit more modern than this book is. So I was looking at, one thing is you can look at who has published it, and it's published by Odom's Press Limited of Long Acre, London. And I looked them up. They're a British publishing company. They operated from 1920 to 1968. So that gives us an upper and lower bound for this book. They're mostly a magazine publisher, competing on children's comics with D.C. Thompson, who do the Beano and the Dandy and all that.
Right.
And they also had the Marvel contract in the 1960s. So they would reprint Marvel comics in their UK
wonderful
children's comics.
Yeah.
And then they've printed
obviously, and this,
Yes.
I've just like, as a slight digression here, you've opened it to the front page. There's just this incredible picture inside the front cover, and it just looks like the kind of modern. It's the thing that Sir Christian, who we do the A periodical with, refers to this as cumulonumbers, yes, which is just like generalised images of maths. But it's got like a quadratic equation and a picture of a mathematical tool, and 22/7 extruded out into a prism, yes, and then just a little Pythagoras proofs, just all these floating around symbols, and then around the outside this is incredible border with pictures of famous mathematicians as little sketches. And there's like Descartes, Euclid, Laplace, Einstein, questionably a mathematician, Kepler, I guess, also one of those sort of slightly physicsy mathematicians, and then Napier and Leibniz and Newton. It's like, why did those ones in particular get picked? Are they featured in the book, or I don't know, but it's so wonderful. It's like one of those sort of black and white kind of dotty, I can't remember what the technique's called, where it's like dots to create shading.
I'm thinking no oil and no gas.
I know.
Anyway, that's good. And anyway, there's no date, but I looked it up, and a few people are selling this, and most of them say it's 1948. So I found one that says 1952. It's a bit hard to tell. So let's say around about then, late 40s, early 50s. Well, this is right as my granddad will have just left school. So it's this sort of complicated thing where he worked in Sheffield Steel. So I asked my dad and said, do you think this was his, or do you think it was his dad's, or what do you think is going on? And my dad says he went to work in steel leaving school, and then he went and did national service, because it was just after the Second World War. He went and did national service, and then he came back and worked in Sheffield Steel the rest of his life. And at some point around then, he went to night school to do metallurgy, and in doing that, he will have done some maths, physics, and chemistry.
Right.
So the theory is that he bought it to support his maths teaching, which is sort of interesting. One thing that gets me about it is the author. So I'm reading this history of the maths profession, which perhaps I'll talk a little bit more about in a minute, but in passing, in the middle of this book, it suddenly refers to Warwick Sawyer as being a noted popularizer of mathematics. And I thought, I've never heard of him. That's interesting. And I sort of think that I know a few people who've done that over the years. I know a bit about history and a bit about popularising mathematics. Never heard of him, so I looked him up. And the thing that I looked up online said his most popular book is Mathematician's Delight. So I've ordered that. It's one of these lovely old penguin books. And I thought, oh, well, I'll have a look at that then, that's fine. It says on the cover, it's one of these where judge a book by its cover. It's got a whole paragraph telling you to buy it on the front cover. It says, designed to convince the general reader that mathematics is not a forbidding science, but an attractive mental exercise. The deserved success of this work is in itself a complete recommendation, says the Higher Education Journal. You know, it's one of these. And so while this was on its way to me from some seller on the internet, I fished out Grandad's old book, opened it up, and it's edited by W. Sawyer, same chap. So suddenly I have a collection of Sawyer's book.
Yeah, that's good.
But yeah, so now I've got 2 of his books, and I think, well, he's an interesting chap. He was an English mathematician, but he worked in Ghana, in New Zealand, in America and Canada. He was only, as far as I can tell, he was in the UK until 1947. So if this book was published in 1948, that might mean it was written in 1947 and then being typeset or something. I just don't quite have the chronology clear. But yeah, and by the way, it's not a very well used book. It doesn't look like it's been well thumbed or anything. So I don't know how much use Grandad got out of it. But perhaps if I talk a bit about education. So for sort of some amount of time in the past, basically what you did was you teach Euclid. And everyone learns geometry, and that teaches people to think correctly. Yeah. And the way you learn Euclid is that you learn to recite Euclid by heart.
Right.
And that will teach you exact thinking.
Seems sensible.
How to be a proper person and things like that. And so there's a movement in the sort of Victorian period that's about basically moving away from just teaching Euclid in the order that Euclid wrote it. And this is very controversial because it's been good enough for 2,000 years. Why would you need to change it now? Versus, you know, can we not actually try and teach people to think mathematically rather than just recite stuff? That's a gross oversimplification. There's an organisation set up in 1871, the Association for the Improvement of Geometrical Teaching, which is apparently the world's first subject association. A lot of subjects get subject associations, but like 20 years later in this country. The Association for the Improvement of Geometrical Teaching in 1897 becomes the Mathematical Association, which is still around today.
Yeah.
So this is the origin of the Maths Association. What's sort of happening is, at that time, you can imagine that basically you go to university, presumably Oxford or Cambridge, get yourself a maths degree, and then you just rock up in a town and set up a school. That's how you become a teacher. Right. Now, you've been involved with the education of teachers.
Yeah,
that's how it works.
Definitely how it works, yeah.
You don't really need to think about how to teach, you just need to bring your copy of Euclid and get people to learn it. And it's, of course, entirely male. I found that there was a great passage in this History of Education book that I'd read, which says, because there's this exam at Cambridge, the Mathematical Tripos, which is the big exam that you take, and then they rank the people, and those are the wranglers. And
they do a whole thing where they shout it off a balcony or something when they give out the results,
And you can be the senior wrangler if you're the top person. And there are various stories around women with this. There's a lady called Charlotte Scott who gets permission in 1880 to study mathematics. But it's this period where you're not allowed the degree. You're allowed to come along and study and take the exam, but you're not allowed to. She wasn't the first, but I think after Charlotte Scott, it then becomes that women are formally allowed and don't have to necessarily just seek permission on a case-by-case basis. And then the one that people tend to know is in 1890, Philippa Fawcett was the first woman to get the highest mark in the Tripos. And because she wasn't allowed the degree, she was announced above the senior wrangler. So she was not She was not the top person. She was above the top man, if you like.
Wow.
Yeah. And this is a huge deal in women's suffrage. Her mum was Millicent Fawcett, suffragist. All in the newspapers about this. Look at the achievements that women can do if we only give them the opportunities. And, you know, it's a lovely part of that history. Anyway, the thing I quite liked in this history of education book was this passage. It says, in the 20 years following the opening of the Tripos examination to women, 250 students took honours in mathematics at Cambridge alone. And it was with the entrance into the teaching profession of this band of highly qualified women that the organisation of mathematical teaching may be said to have begun.
Wow.
So it's like, until that point, it's a bunch of blokes just doing Euclid, and then suddenly women start coming along and actually think about how to do it properly.
Well, I'm not going to say anything, but yeah.
Yes. And then there's all sorts of reforms going through time. So it's like there was this thing called the Perry movement, which is all about practical mathematics, because they're really, really teaching Euclid. They're doing ruler and compass. They aren't even doing like coordinates or things like this, or graphs or anything like that. And there's this whole thing around the use of graph paper was extremely controversial. As a sort of, well, you're not teaching them to think rigorously. You're just getting them to draw things on graph paper. This sort of attitude, I guess. So the tension between the rigorous abstract mathematics and this, what gets called practical mathematics, and also people who are into teaching through doing experiments, through doing numerical work, through drawing graphs and things like this, and building models of physical things that students can act with to try and understand, grow their understanding. And it's, I think, sort of a tension between whether you get students to move quickly through a bunch of stuff and kind of get a working knowledge of a wide range of stuff, or whether you just dig them really deep into plane geometry and treat it really rigorously, and therefore they learn exact thinking and that sort of thing.
Well, I guess it depends what they're going to use it for, right? Because they're definitely not going to use that level of geometry.
Yeah, so then there's a whole subcategory of this whole debate around the needs of engineering and the needs of technical education, which of course then, this is more or less the point where I thought, my granddad who worked his life in Sheffield Steel has a maths book. I wonder what that's like.
Yeah.
So this is probably from the late 1940s. Around that time, at the end of Second World War is when they separate out primary school and secondary school. And then there's this whole thing where there are grammar schools and secondary modern schools and technical schools. And you basically have to take an exam at 11 and it gets decided whether you're going to be a technical
high
person
achiever,
or, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Which, I mean, it's just, I don't know, I find that I moved schools at 9 and became a lot better at succeeding in my new school than I was in my old school. But you sort of think people have all sorts of different trajectories, don't they, in life? But sort of what do engineers need to know for their maths, and maybe the needs of maths are not just training more maths teachers at Cambridge, sort of thing. And then there's this period, and that's where this book sits, I think, where all these debates have been going on. Teachers are kind of in control of the syllabus, and universities are setting the exams that happen at the end of it. The stuff that we're more used to now, like the national curriculum and governments controlling exams and things like that, that's decades away at this point. That's sort of 1980s territory. So anyway, so in that context is this book, and my granddad, we think, at night school, doing metallurgy and needing to know a bit of mathematics. So there's this book, and I'm going to invite you to have a look through this book, but I quite like, well, I thought it would be very, at the sort of rigorous, but also either that or at the here's how to convey, if you want to take something to Newcastle and sell it, here are the weights that they use there, that sort of. Yeah. But I think that's a century older, I don't think that's this time.
There's a really nice sentence on the first page. Yeah. On the sort of description of what the book is that I was just really enjoying. It says, a novel and simplified approach in which mathematical processes are related to everyday affairs.
So this is it. This is Sawyer's thing. So it's like A Mathematician's Delight, designed to convince the general reader mathematics is not a forbidding science, but an attractive mental exercise. And this is, so I think Sawyer is involved with this movement. In fact, I've seen references to him. Around making it relevant and making it something that kids can engage with.
But people are still doing that now, right?
Yeah.
We still have these conversations about, like, is maths too abstract, and do we need real life applications and things to motivate the teaching of it?
So this, you think, is really modern, right? But the opening talks about how to learn from a book, basically, and one of the sections is called Traditional Mistakes, as in things that go wrong with teaching. And it says, perhaps the most serious defect in old schools is lack of purpose. The lessons strike children as being futile, as leading nowhere. Boys and girls are always asking, why do we have to do this? Where does it lead to?
Really?
You think this is now?
That's
this is
new,
not
is
then.
it? Yeah.
Surely.
Wow.
And he says these are very reasonable questions. You only have one life to live and you don't want to waste it on futile and unnecessary things. And goes on like this.
Wow.
And so one thing that I noticed when you open this book is that it's full of these pictures of like real things or things that you can build. And I've seen a section here somewhere. He talks about a serious deficit in the traditional classroom was the absence of things to see and touch and handle. Children were expected to reason accurately about the acreage of fields without ever having seen a field or knowing what an acre looked like. Expected to understand tons without ever having seen a weighing machine, blah, blah, blah. So if you just sort of open the book at random, you find, I think the spine's a bit broken, but it keeps falling open on this page, which is like there's a town and a river running through the town, and then when you look at the back, it's actually connected to a tap, and it's like a model of a dam, isn't it? So he's obviously sort of proposing that you might, and I've seen a section where he says, if you can't get hold of these things, then make them, because you can always make models.
Well, yeah, I've just recently done a project where we're writing a book with the Science Museum, and as part of that, we got the chance to sort of talk to their archivists about the objects that they've got in their collection. And they were basically, like, they came to us and they're like, what can we do for you? What can we show you? And one of the things they're really excited about is they've got a lot of objects that are basically teaching aids from, engineering, from maths, from, like, historical science teaching that have basically just been built to demonstrate concepts. And they've got, like, if you went to the Science Museum's maths collection previously, before they recently revamped it, they just had them all out in a room because they didn't have anything else to do with them. They've got all these ruled surfaces made out of bits of string and like all these incredible things that actually really concretize mathematical ideas. And it's right, that if you're just sort of thinking about something abstractly or trying to do a sketch of it or trying to represent it in 2D, it doesn't really get it there. And sometimes just having a physical thing to hold and look at. And I guess the modern resurgence of things like, not resurgence, but initial surgence of things like GeoGebra, where you can do these sort of dynamic, sometimes 3D visualizations of things, but see stuff in a way that makes it a bit more tangible.
Yeah, much more than a bit of paper does. Yeah, I remember going to a museum, I think in Glasgow, where I don't know if it was Kelvin, but somebody had made and there were like these wooden models of different surfaces, same sort of thing, to try and get you an idea of how these things work.
Well, and I guess nowadays research mathematicians could just 3D print something.
That's true.
If they've discovered a new object or shape or something. It's incredible how quickly the discovery of the new monotile, you saw physical copies of it popping up online, people sharing pictures.
Yeah,
it's just great.
I've not got into 3D printing, and I've not got myself a monotile. But yeah, people within days were laser cutting them and 3D printing them and all sorts. Yeah.
But yeah, the illustrations in here are really nicely done. And I guess you never know whether it's the author doing illustrations or whether they've got an illustrator. But, there's lots of, like, things like thinking about cube numbers and pictures of cubes, obviously making it a bit more kind of easy to understand. And I guess a lot of this is kind of engineering applications as well. Yeah. There's pictures of suspension bridges alongside all the calculations for steel girders and stuff. Yeah. I mean, it's sort of this idea of having applications and reasons to want to know the answers to these mathematical questions. It's still quite difficult to sort of keep those, like, to tease those two things together almost. For it to not feel very sort of shoehorned, like, here.
Yeah, that's what I haven't looked at the detail of how he does that, because a lot of the time, well, I remember this when I taught maths for forensic scientists, that it's really hard. What I basically did was there was a little syllabus, and when I took on the module, I went round all the forensic science lecturers and said, do you really need them to know this, that and the other? Or am I just teaching this because that's what mathematicians have always taught, frankly? And the answer was, yes, we need them to know all of these things. So, like, they needed to know simultaneous equations, because sometimes you mix two chemicals and they react, and then you measure the result, and that gives you two equations with two variables in them. So you need to know how to solve that. They need to know quadratics, because they might, at some point, they do ballistics, and they need to understand projectiles and things like that. And so all the stuff that was in the syllabus was there, but it was used at a level that I couldn't possibly teach them, as I think they were... I think it was foundation year, so it was kind of the year before undergraduate study starts proper, And it's really hard to go in there with your full-on ballistics example that has an embedded quadratic equation in it. Or often you end up with students where it's like, yeah, you do need this, but where you need this is when it's in a system of PDEs, and I'm teaching you how to differentiate, so I can't show you the system of PDEs. All I can do is sort of wave my arms a bit, and then you end up coming up with quite contrived examples. And so I remember I had one for my forensic scientists where a gun had been fired and you found the bullet in the wall, and by knowing how far the bullet had dropped you could work out how far away the person was from the wall when they fired it, because the drop is just governed by acceleration due to gravity. So you can find out, if you know how far it's dropped, you know how long the bullet was travelling for, and if you know how long it was travelling for. But that requires you to know exactly the make of the gun and how fast the bullet comes out of it, and exactly, to an astonishing degree of accuracy, where the gun was, how high the gun was when it was fired. And if you know, like, why do you know how high the gun was, but not, and like any amount of error in a room is just going to blow the thing out the water, because bullets travel so quickly. So I was like, this is really flimsy. Why do you know how high the gun was but not how far from the wall it is? That makes no sense at all.
Yeah.
And yet the students really responded to it, and they came to my class and did some quadratic equations exercises, extremely engaged, because they'd seen that there was a relevance to their course. And I'm like, well, it's a sort of made up thing, but it's at the other end of the wedge from the, you know, Billy buys 30 watermelons and eats 12 of them kind of problem, isn't it? Where you're sort of trying to pretend that it's a real life.
Yeah.
So I don't know how he manages that in this book, and how actually relevant the maths is to what he's discussing.
I think the section that I've opened it on here is, there's a lot of nice stuff about ratio and about fractions and about looking at proportion, and it's interleaved with lots of really nice examples of real world applications. So there's things like gear ratios. There's some stuff about hydraulics. There's a bit about scaling down a theatre to a puppet theatre, which is just glorious. Like, you know, in terms of the angles of vision that you need to have in order to be able to see the stage.
Right.
And then it even goes on to like scaling text down onto a poster and that kind of thing. Stuff with electricity and different voltages and things. So I guess it's sort of, it feels a bit like it's just jumping between lots of different examples, but I think these are all kind of similar, like, applications of the same maths, which I guess is a nice way to sort of introduce a concept and then reinforce it a bunch. I believe that's a thing. I'm not an expert in this, but, you know, that's a thing that teachers do, right? Yeah.
Yeah. I'm trying to work out what section anything is.
Yeah, the headings aren't particularly illustrative.
No, but they're all by different people. So Sawyer is the
editor,
yeah, kind of the editor, and there are about 4 people writing chapters, and he's one of them. So,
well, I think that was basic operations of arithmetic.
Right.
So.
Wesley. So we don't know who that is either. Yeah, and there's loads of stuff. So there's a foreword, Professor H. Levy, which starts, "It is sometimes maintained that mathematics comes easily only to those who have a special gift or flair for it, and those who are born without this ability in a scientific age are necessarily handicapped from the cradle to the grave. Nothing could be further from the truth. Of course some people are colourblind or tone deaf, and this will limit their power as painters or musicians." He says, but nowhere is there any evidence of a mathematical sense in which some people may be deficient at birth. Like any other language, of course, the language of mathematics has to be learnt so that the person may be able to speak intelligently and express his thoughts clearly. And sort of goes on this basis, that basically this is all, when I think about the maths anxiety research that people are doing, and the whole societal attitude to, you know, I'm not a maths person, it doesn't go in my brain properly and stuff, and here they are, you know, all these years ago.
Well, I mean, like, technically there are like things like dyscalculia, which is specifically to do with numbers, but obviously maths is much broader than just calculations and numbers, and you know, there are lots of really good techniques and approaches to deal with that kind of thing. So I think his specific point that there isn't anything necessarily specific kind of falls down slightly. But this is basically a thing that I'm constantly saying, the idea of being a maths person or being not a maths person is something that I think people just lean on. You know, they'll kind of use it as an excuse to not, you know, be successful, and whether the reason they're not successful is just because they're not really trying, or you know, they've had a bad experience and it's, you know, it's meant that it's more difficult for them to make progress. But I don't know if I can honestly say that I think there is a way in which some people are naturally better at maths than others. It's a lot of it is about opportunity and about privilege and about circumstances.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
He talks here about maths teachers basically don't have the advantage that maths is really relevant. He says the idea that mathematics is divorced from ordinary life, and then holds up French and German as examples where it's really relevant to your life.
Of course, yeah. Everyone needs to be able to speak French and German.
And that's the way to the swimming pool or whatever
it
is.
Yeah. Although they do say maths is a language, right? They think it's productive to think of it as a language rather than any other type of subject. But I think you know what? I think it's a maths. I think you can't really put it in a category with anything else like that, because it's sort of a language and it's sort of science and it's sort of a problem solving.
Yeah, there's
thing,
a big stained glass window at Birmingham University that has all the subjects, and half of them are arts and the other half are sciences.
Oh God, why would you do that?
And maths is on the art side.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, that's incredible. Yeah, I've spent weekend visiting art galleries with myself and another mathematician. It's just like, what are we doing here? This is ludicrous. But no, apparently not. Yeah.
And then, lastly, there's a section at the end which is Guide to Further Study, which is kind of, if you've got this far and you like it, here's what you might want to do next. And it's got this chapter called How Mathematics Grows. And, mathematical discoveries and inventions, like all other discoveries and inventions, are due to two causes. First, the fact that certain people exist who delight to discover and invent. Secondly, to there being some practical problem that needs solving. And he sort of goes on for several pages about how mathematicians work, and the mathematician is not content to do only the problems that have been set to him. He wants to feel sure that he will be able to solve any problem that anybody may ever be able to bring to him, and all this sort of thing. It's sort
Excellent.
of perseverance, and it's just got so many things that I think are that I think people have come to more recently than this, and it turns out no.
Yeah, back in the 1940s this was already known. Yeah.
Incredible, isn't it?
Although we are now aware that women can do maths, so that's good. Pictures of mathematicans in the front are all men.
They are.
All the
that's
mathematicians
true.
are referred to as him. But
I did like his lack of purpose, where he says boys and girls are asking why do we? Because saying him, that was just that. My son and I, we've just read Alice in Wonderland again, and now we're reading The Adventures of Tom Sawyer. And Alice in Wonderland, they're both written around the same sort of time, but it's very much, there is a habit where you say he if you mean a generic person, and also where you say it if you mean an animal. So Alice will talk lovingly about her cat and refer to her cat as it, which to my ear sounds, not very nice. Whereas in Tom Sawyer, they refer to animals as he or she. And so there's obviously this sort of shift going on. And the same, it's so common, isn't it, that people say he when they mean
Now of course, mathematicians are just it. Yeah.
That's the fair way of dealing with it, yeah.
That is a lovely book. I think it's kind of a slice of history as well as a slice of mathematics. I like it.
Yes, and I enjoy it for the personal connection, although I don't quite understand the personal connection at this point. But
well, it's an insight, isn't it? It's a little glimpse. Yeah. Okay, well, both Peter and I can be found on both Twitter and on Mastodon, which is a maths instance of Mastodon. I'm at Steckles.
I'm at Peter Rowlett.
We both blog at aperiodical.com, which is where you can find more episodes of the show.
And if you want to say anything to us, if you have any thoughts or suggestions or books we'd like to read, you can email us objects@aperiodical.com. The music is Funk Game Loop by Kevin MacLeod, licensed under Creative Commons. Thank you.